Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Gabhart, and appreciate you taking the opportunity to spend a little time with us exploring behavior-driven development. So this is a half-day webinar. We're going to have a few hours together exploring BDD, get a little taste for how it works and what it's good at. And along the way, as you have questions, feel free to post those in chat. There will also be some opportunities if you'd like to weigh in. We'll be happy to have a dialogue and conversation around it. So we're going to be looking at behavior-driven development, initially at just some of the basics, foundations of what it's designed for, what it's effective at. We'll move on to talking about the syntax that's used in BDD, known as gherkin, and that is how we describe the acceptance criteria for our stories in BDD. From there, we'll look at BDD scenarios from the perspective of acceptance criteria. We'll also talk about regular expressions, especially their use in Cucumber, which is one of the more popular BDD frameworks. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what constitutes good BDD scenarios and bad ones and how to be most effective. You'll obviously have the slide deck that you can see here. But additionally, along the way, there is a PDF available for you. So if you look in the Handouts tab, there's a PDF you can pull down. That way you've got direct access to the materials in addition to what you'll see on the screen. So first, behavior-driven development, BDD, really stems from the Agile community. And specifically, it carries with it the B for behavior, which is where we're describing the desired behavior of the software. So we're not talking about your behavior needing to be developed. We're talking about the behavior of the software. And we're not trying to drive different behaviors for you, but instead drive the project in pursuit of the desired behavior. And so we identify what is it that this software ought to do. What are the things that it needs to be capable of solving? And then we drive the project around those outcomes that we're aiming to achieve. The development piece of it is that as we drive that, we want to ensure that the development work is linked back to it through automated tooling. And so really, behavior-driven development is all about accomplishing a shared understanding between business, between IT, and between QA, so that there is a complete understanding of what we're trying to produce, and that's achieved through specific examples. There's 5 core elements that go into BDD, and you see those outlined in the box here on the right. Natural language constructs, because any of the acceptance criteria and ultimately the tests that we derive are all expressed in normal English sentences. But we also recognize in the context of those normal English sentences that there is in fact the potential for miscommunication, specifically for there to be ambiguity. And the way that we address that ambiguity is by identifying what are those key terms that are overloaded, most likely for our industry, and what can we do to address those by calling them out, defining them very clearly, and then ensuring that whatever the definition is, we consistently use that across the scenarios and ultimately across our stories. We want the process to be shared. It's not just an IT thing. It's shared by BA, it's shared by QA, as well as by the devs. And we want not only for the process to be shared, but for the tooling to be shared as much as possible. And then when it's realistic, we want to automate these activities. So how many times have you seen in a project where someone said, well, maybe that's what I said, but that's not what I meant? BDD is particularly cognizant of this and aims to identify those potential pitfalls and address them. I'm sure we're all familiar with the parable of the swing, where the customer explained it one way, but various people on the team and in the project understood it differently, until ultimately we get to what they really wanted or what they really needed, and it's substantially different than what we understood. What behavior-driven development really strives to achieve is to cut through all that noise and to get us to the point of taking the explanation from the customer and immediately translating that into, well, what would that look like? How would that manifest itself in a real world context? What would a concrete example of utilizing that entail? And as we talk through that, then the customer can go, well, no, that's not what I mean. Or, well, in that specific situation, we do it this way instead of that way. And as we continue to work through those concrete examples, we achieve a consensus and achieve clarity on what the customer really and truly needs. So let's take a simple example. Let's say that you are working for an insurance company and your team has been tasked with developing the quote functionality within the rating engine for an insurance business. And so there's an existing rating engine and you've got to develop the quote functionality for it. Well, the quote functionality is there, but specifically another capability on the quote, which is to solve for a risk premium factor to be added based off of a product's credit score. And you have the following business rules that have been provided to you. If this prospective customer has less than a 580 credit score, then we add 25% to whatever the rating engine gives us. If, on the other hand, they have a prime, then meaning more than 580, then we add 0%. We just take exactly the quote that comes from the rating engine. If it's super prime, which we're defining as more than 720, then we take whatever the normal cost is going to be and actually give them a 10% discount. And so the question is this enough information to deliver a working feature? Behavior-driven development would argue that it is. Now, some of you may question that and go, hold on, Kyle. It seems like there's not enough information. I see less than 580. I see more than 580. I see more than 720. But what happens if it lands perfectly on one of those boundaries? Especially what happens if it lands perfectly on 580, where we've got one business rule saying less than, one business rule saying more than. How do we resolve that? And so we might be tempted to push back to the business and say, I just don't have enough information to start working on this. But BDD argues that you do. Not because the boundary conditions don't matter, but because by working through concrete examples, that's actually how you achieve clarity. So the way to resolve the ambiguity is by calling it out and saying, okay, and you play this back to the business. You say, so given a credit score of 570, when a quote is run, then the premium is 25%. And you're probably pretty comfortable with that figure because they told you anything less than 580 is 25%. So really on that first one, we're just kind of getting validation. But then on the second one, I would say instead of plugging in the 0%, you almost imagine some ellipses. And you just kind of ask it more in the form of a question. You say, so given a credit score of 580 when a quote is run, then the premium is, and you kind of leave it open-ended for them to answer that. And they would go, oh, well, it's 0%. You go, oh yeah, of course it's 0%. And so rather than push back on them and say, look, I don't know about these boundary conditions between 580 less, 580 more, because the business may not even, think of it in those terms. They probably don't. Computers do, but humans don't. But when you give them a concrete example and say, okay, so let's say I've got a prospect with a credit score of exactly 580. When a quote is run, what should that premium be? And then they'll answer probably very naturally, oh, well, of course it's 0%. And so that gives you the clarity you need. And so then from there, you just work out any of the concrete examples that you need to iron out these questions. And so now we have very specific examples of distinct values and what the outcome should be. Now, if you take these examples, convert them into tests, and drive all the development, and for that matter, scope the development work based off of those tests, that's what behavior-driven development is really all about. So if that's how we do those concrete scenarios, how does it fit into the notion of a story? Well, first, let's understand that there's a few key elements of BDD. Given, when, then, meaning that we structure all of our scenarios using that terminology. So if I back up for a second and show you, and you'll see it, it says given a credit score of 570, when a quote is run, then the premium is 25%. And so that given, when, then structure is very important. Given describes the initial context. In that context, as you sort of set the stage with the given, or maybe with several given statements, you then have a triggering event, something that's going to transpire. An actor is going to click on a button, an actor is going to engage by submitting a form, or they're going to give you an invoice, or whatever it is, some action occurs. The then describes an expected outcome, something that can be validated to determine that given this set of conditions, when this event occurred, then you actually got the results you expected to get. And this is all designed around the way people naturally talk. If you ask someone, hey, what do you expect the system to do? They'll probably say something pretty naturally like, well, when I do X, I expect Y. And so all we're doing is just introducing a little bit extra beyond that, which is the given, to say, okay, let's lay out some assumptions, establish some context, given all of these things being true, when I do X, then Y should happen. So I see a hand raised. Somebody had a question. Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead. Oh, looks like Elizabeth lowered her hand. Not a problem. If there is a question and you don't perhaps have the ability to directly access it via the software, feel free to post a question in chat, and I'm more than happy to address that. Okay. So that tells us about the structure of the scenarios. How about the BDD story itself? How does it all link back into a story? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the classic Agile story. It has a user-centric focus. What I mean by that is it starts with the user, always. As a manager, as a customer, as a support person, as a client, whatever it is. As a blank, I want whatever the functionality is, the goal that I'm trying to achieve, so that, and then that's the reason or the motivation. I liken this to the questions of who, what, and why. There's a little bit of a problem with that classic structure, though, and that is that we're leading with what I would argue is the least important information out of the three. And I'm not saying that who is unimportant, because it matters. But really, when we think about who is doing it, when we think about what the functionality is, the actual functionality that we're dealing with, and then we think about the business motivation, the value that we're going to get out of it, out of those three pieces of information, I would hazard a guess that who is the least important out of those, versus the functionality and versus the business value of doing this in the first place. And yet, it's what the classic story leads with. The other problem is, far too often I'll find people writing stories that have an as-a and have an I want, and they've completely dropped the business motivation. Like it's not even on the radar at all. And so they make sure and get those first two pieces of information, but by the time it gets to the business value, they're like, whatever. The other problem is sometimes they'll have it, but it doesn't matter, because the way they phrase it ends up being basically just a recharacterization of what's already there. So they pretty much just restate in slightly different words what they already have. That's how the BDD story really changes things. It shifts the focus to being value-based rather than user-focused. And by being focused on the value, it leads with the why. After the why comes the who, and then finally the what. There's no question you're not going to forget the functionality piece. The I want to, submit the request. I want to process the paperwork. I want to enroll a new member, I want to process the invoice. I mean, whatever it might be, you're going to do the functionality. And there's going to be a role. You're going to have the as of. But by leading with the value, it makes sure you don't forget that piece of information, and it puts it front and center. It puts arguably the most important thing, the business value, the why. It puts it right up front and makes sure that we don't miss it. So that's a key part of what's happening with BDD. And so the question, I've got a question from Louis or Louise, I apologize, whichever that might be. Does this differ from user stories in Scrum? It differs only in the sense of what I just described, which is it differs in that it's changing the structure of it. You're still going to have user stories in your Scrum, but what BDD would advocate is that you should flip the script on it, lead with the why in the way your story is structured, follow it with the who and the what. The last part, and maybe this was really where your question was coming from, is the given, when, then part, and how that links into the story. And that's what we're going to cover next. So the complete BDD structure would look like this. The title, whatever the name of your story is, right? The narrative. So the title is just your handle, basically. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words describing the story. The narrative, though, is what you're used to when you think about a story. It's the I want to so that. Except, again, I'm going to advocate that what you do is in order to I want to. So you lead with the value, you lead with the why, followed by the who, followed by the what. And that is your story. Where in addition to flipping the script on the order, the other critical thing BDD does is it moves into the realm of acceptance criteria, giving you something really concrete. Because here's the thing I would posit back to you. For those of you that have done Agile, you've been told, thou shalt have acceptance criteria. And yet, no one's ever shown you a concrete, consistent, repeatable structure for what your acceptance criteria should look like. And so everybody just kind of makes it up on the fly. BDD changes the game and gives you a very tangible understanding of what acceptance criteria ought to look like. Given is for describing the initial conditions, things that have to be true before the scenario starts. When is the triggering event that kicks off that scenario, and then is the expected outcome. And so now you can have very well-defined acceptance criteria for your story that say, my story doesn't live in a vacuum. My story manifests itself in the form of concrete scenarios. One such concrete scenario is X. And given these things, when this thing happens, then these are the outcomes I expect. Another concrete scenario for my story is Y. And given these things, when this event occurs, then this is the outcome I expect. And yet another scenario for my story is Z, and so on and so forth. So my story is that I have an account holder at the bank who wants to withdraw cash. Specifically, the narrative is that in order to easily access my money as an account holder, I want to withdraw cash from an ATM. The why, the business value, is easily accessing my money. The who is an account holder. And the functionality, the what, is withdrawing cash from an ATM. And so our first scenario is that the account has sufficient funds, given the account balance is $100, and, which by the way is just extending the given, and the card is valid, and the machine contains enough cash. So all three of those constitute the given. So given, $100 in the account, a valid card, and the machine has enough cash. When the account holder requests $20, then the ATM should dispense $20, and the account balance should be $80, and the card should be returned. So we've got three givens, one when, three thens, And what we've done with that is we've established the preconditions. We've introduced a specific action that takes place. And we've identified that we then anticipate 3 measurable, verifiable outcomes from that. And so we can determine, and ultimately we can test, that that scenario has occurred. At the end of your sprint, at the end of your iteration, your story is considered acceptable if it passes each scenario attached to it. Thus, the scenarios with the given when then structure that BDD promotes constitute the acceptance criteria. Scenario 2, same story. Now the account has insufficient funds. So given a balance of 10, card is valid, machine contains enough cash. When the account holder requests $20, then the ATM should not dispense cash, and the account balance should be $10, and the card should be returned. So here we've got a set of givens, two of which are similar to what we had before, right? If we were to walk it back, we'd go, yeah, card being valid, machine containing enough cash, that's the same. What's changed is we have a different balance. What about the action? Well, actually, in both cases, the action is request $20. What's changed is one of the givens has changed, so now requesting $20 becomes a problem because our balance is only 10. And so our thens change because it's a different context, even though it's the same action. Our thens now say, don't dispense any cash. Account balance should be unchanged. It should still be $10, and we still return the card. Lastly, third scenario, same story. Given the card is disabled, and that's the only given in this case. When the account holder requests their $20, then the ATM should retain the card, and the ATM should say the card has been retained. Now, a lot of times when people see this, they go, Kyle, the $100, the $10, the $20, that's weird. Like, shouldn't I say if they request anything less than $500, because that's how much they're allowed to request in a day? Or shouldn't I say something like between, $10 and $100, because they're allowed to choose it in $100 increments or whatever, or $10 to account balance or something? So often we try to cover these broad ranges, and we try to cover this, here's this one description of a scenario that accounts for every possible outcome. And one of the beauties of BDD and the simplicity of it is that they go, no, that's what's gotten us into hot water all these years, is trying to account for everything. If you really want power, if you really want to be able to achieve something impressive and make progress with your client, then what you want to do is you want to spell out a specific concrete scenario so that you can give them something tangible to work with. And by giving them something tangible to work with, you get past all the fluff. You get past all of the assumptions that were made. So if I go back to what we said we were trying to do to begin with, we're trying to cut past all the misinterpretation. The way you do that is by providing a concrete, tangible use of the swing, and then they go, oh, well, now that you put it that way, it should do this. And it seems very obvious once it's a concrete scenario. It's when we're talking about it in the abstract that there's so many opportunities for miscommunication. And so what BDD espouses is we've got to break it down to very specific scenarios, and that frees our brains from being lost in abstraction, so we can talk about what really is going on and what the outcome ought to be in that case. So Kara asks a very appropriate question, and one that comes up pretty often, which is, okay, that all sounds good. How many scenarios do I need? All right, so when we looked at the first little goofy example, we had 4, right? Back up here for a second. We had 4 scenarios. And then this one I built for you had 3. Okay, so how many should we have? It all depends. Of course you knew I was going to say that, but what does it depend on? Well, I will tell you this. A story with 1 scenario is probably wrong. If for no other reason, then you could create a happy path scenario and a non-happy path scenario. So I would hazard a guess that every story ought to have at least 2 scenarios, or said differently, at least 2 acceptance criteria. And the reality is that most stories should have quite a bit more than just 2. Because it really comes down to not just what is the happy path and what is the non-happy path, but really what are, using kind of an 80-20 rule, what are the main paths? What are the primary scenarios? What are the big rocks that we need to solve for? I'm not worried about all the pebbles. I certainly don't need to fill this thing in with sand. But what are the big rocks that constitute the proverbial 20% that addresses the 80% of situations? That having been said, it's probably going to be on some kind of a bell curve, some kind of a standard deviation distribution type of thing. And so I'd expect the bulk of your stories to be somewhere in the middle. A few of them might only have a couple of scenarios. A few of them might have quite a few scenarios. If you find every single story has 2 scenarios, you're probably scoping them wrong. If you find every single story has 30 scenarios, I'm certain you're scoping it wrong. If you find that everything kind of hovers in the ballpark of 7 plus or minus 2, somewhere in the 5 to 9 or 10 range is the bulk of them, you're probably getting it about right. It is not an exact science. I'm not telling you that if you have a story that there's 30, then it's wrong. I'm not telling you that you have a story that has only 2 scenarios or even just 1 scenario. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying if everything's coming up with 1 or 2 or everything's coming up with 20, you're missing the boat. It's probably a standard distribution of some kind. Kara also asked, should stories be smaller pieces so it doesn't become overwhelming? I would put it this way. I would say stories should be at whatever level they normally are. And as you start to carve out scenarios, what the scenarios are really doing for you is helping you uncover risk. They're helping you recognize that the story that you thought was a medium story really isn't. Because hiding inside of it were 2 medium stories and a small story. So really that should have been a large story to begin with. And so it helps you to uncover hidden complexity that may result in you breaking out new stories that in turn have their own scenarios. So Mary, I don't quite understand your question. If you can rephrase it, I'm happy to answer it. But for right now, I'll move on, and then as you rephrase it, I'll be happy to come back and address it. So let's go back to this this story and set of scenarios I gave you. Did anything jump out at you? Anything catch your eye about it? So the good thing about the stories was that we used the word should throughout, and we gave specific values that were verifiable in the then statement. We could actually determine that it did or did not do those things. So that's really good. The should part sometimes throws people off. And it throws people off because what we're looking for there is, people think, well, you're just saying what it should do, and we want to know what it actually does. Well, we're coming at this from a testing standpoint. So it really is going to be what it should do, meaning we're indicating, here's what I expect, here's what I anticipate, this is what it should be offering, should be doing, should be providing. But then the third thing, or the next category is what was bad about it. So what was bad about it is that the terminology wasn't consistent. Sometimes we used ATM, and sometimes we used machine. Now, us as humans could readily flip back and forth between ATM and machine, and it didn't bother us. But that's one of those things that injects ambiguity. That's one of those things where there can be significant misunderstanding, and that's just not good enough. We need to be clear. We need to be consistent in the way that we're putting this together. The other problem, and this is the really ugly part, is that beyond just being inconsistent, we can't be ambiguous. And the phrase enough cash is one that's ambiguous, because I don't know what enough cash refers to. Enough cash for this particular transaction, enough cash for the whole day. Is this enough cash because of what it ought to have on a particular business day, on a particular client? There's just no way of knowing what enough cash means. And so that's simply too vague for us to be able to build any kind of expectations around. Any questions on that? Okay. So we've got our BDD story, leading with the business value, following with the role, and then finally with the core functionality itself. We then have attached to that specific scenarios that spell out in a concrete fashion what's taking place, given, when, and then. So we've got our initial context, followed by our triggering event, followed by our expected outcome. So what I'd like you to do now on your own is define for yourself a scope of a project. This could be a specific system or a process, maybe at your current company, or you might just want to choose something outside of that world, and it could be something simple, a startup business, you could be doing drone delivery of coffee. Maybe that's the next wave of is people not even going into coffee shops. They do a mobile order, and maybe a drone brings them coffee. It doesn't really matter what it is. Just choose some context. Then I want you to define, and you can write it down or you can type it into maybe a Word document or something, 2 user stories that could realistically fit into that scope. You'll want to do an in order to, an as a, and I want to. Then choose one of those stories and craft a BDD scenario with one or perhaps several givens, a single when, and then one or perhaps several thens that constitute the outcome. So I want you to take a few minutes and put that together. I'm actually going to give you 7 minutes to do that exercise on your own, and then I'm going to have a couple of you share your answers via the chat. But don't share it now. We'll wait until we get to that point. And then as I critique those answers, that will give everybody an opportunity to kind of look at their own things that they came up with and see where they might be able to improve or adjust what they did. So like I said, I'm going to give you 7 minutes. Go ahead and work on that. Okay, welcome back. Who is feeling brave and willing to put their some of their content out there so we can have a discussion around it? Okay, Craig, thank you very much. Let me see. So I've got you unmuted, Craig. If you have a microphone you can share. If not, then just type it.
Sure. How do I type it? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. You're doing great.
Okay, just put it in the chat window, you mean?
Yeah, or since you've got the ability to talk, you're welcome to just verbally share it.
All right. I can paste it in here. So it's in the chat window.
Okay, great.
And then let me just.
Okay. So we're looking to easily, quickly open new banking accounts. In order to open a new account, we must validate the identity of the client. And so the scenario is, given there is X years of credit history for the given client, when the client answers X out of N questions correctly, then they are eligible for auto approval. So the thing that we would want to do here, by the way, so everything is right in terms of the structure, everything's kind of in the places that it needs to be. Here's what BDD does that's really interesting. For the scenario to be considered concrete, what we want to do is call out in the given statement anything that constitutes kind of setting the stage, if you will. And one piece of advice I like to give people is think of it in terms of what are all the nouns. Whatever all the nouns are, those are the things we ought to call out in the given. So I would, we've got the client there, for example. I would actually start off with given a client. Given a client has 10 years of credit history. And then that's the next piece that's interesting about BDD is whereas our tendency usually is to give a range, our tendency is usually to say whatever the quote appropriate amount is or some amount or a certain amount, like we use these vague terms, and the problem is that that's what hamstrings the business from being able to give us meaningful insight in terms of what they actually expect to happen. And so what we would want to see instead is just come up with a specific example. And it's not the quintessential example, it's just an example. And it's one that we're able to use. And so it's like if we look back at the example that I used here, we said the account balance was $10. There's nothing magic about it being $10. The reason it matters that it's $10 though, is so that then whenever we attempt to request 20 bucks, we can then validate in the then statement that we still have 10. Or in the prior one, that if we started with 100 and we take out 20, we need to be able to validate and actually prove that there is exactly 80 in there. And so that's the other shift that BDD is going to encourage is first call out all of the different nouns, all the different pieces. And actually, so if this scenario here was to be done correctly, it would actually do something more along the lines of given an account holder, given an account balance, given a card, given a machine, like it would call out all the nouns. And this one didn't happen to, but it was just for space reasons. So the given lays out all the nouns. We just choose a specific number, 5 years of credit history, 30 years of credit history, 1 year of credit history. It doesn't matter, but we choose it because what's fascinating is when you talk to the business and you say, yeah, it'll just be whatever the right amount of years of credit history is or whatever. Whenever we talk in generic terms, they go, oh, okay, that's fine. And then you'll get to the actual implementation and they'll go, hey, how come this is happening this way for people that only have 6 months of credit history? And you're like, because you said it applies to everyone. They're like, oh, no, no, no. If you have less than 1 year of credit history, we need to do this different thing. And you go, whoa, 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 when did that happen? And they're like, oh, well, it's always been that way. But because we didn't call out a specific number, it doesn't crystallize it for people, and they end up giving us bad data to work off of. Versus when we pigeonhole them and tell them 10 years, then it's fascinating the way they then go, oh, you know what, come to think of it, if it's 2 years, we do something different. And if it's 12 years, we actually do something completely different, or whatever it might be. So call out more givens for all the things that are nouns. Use real numbers. Here's the last thing. this is a really common trap that people fall into. It's really easy when you're building a scenario to build it like workflow. And you'll say, given step A, when step B happens, then step C happens. And we actually see that kind of happening here. So given that you do actually have conditions on the given, which is great. And the when is an action, but the problem is the then isn't a verifiable, validatable outcome. It's a, now they can go do this other thing. Now they can do some other activity. Now they're eligible to do a different thing instead of landing on where they're at right now. Now, a way you could still keep that but tweak it slightly, we would add another given statement, even beyond the ones I already said, that would say given auto approval eligibility is false, or you know, said more fluidly, given they are not eligible for auto approval. You would then go through and do the when, and instead of answers X out of N, it would be 5 out of 10 or whatever it is. It would then say, then they are eligible for auto approval. And so that now is something we can verify. We can verify that they weren't when we started, this concrete action occurred, and then they were when we ended. Does that make sense?
It might help if you just, I don't know if you rewrite that. So I got the first part. Given client has 10 years of credit history, when client answers, say, 4 out of 5 questions successfully about the credit history, you're saying you don't like, then they're eligible. You'd rather, I don't know how you, because like there's many conditions that make them eligible, right? And anything that falls off of where they're not eligible, they have to go into like a manual review. So
Sure.
we need like many conditions can make them eligible. As soon as one is not eligible, as soon as you get one condition where it's not, where it's not happy path, they fall into a manual review. So I'm not sure how you'd rewrite that.
Sure.
If you have time.
Yeah.
You don't have to do that now.
No, it's fine. So here's what I would do. And I started to kind of do it in the software, and that was actually kind of clunky. So I'm going to do it slightly differently, which is I'm going to do just Notepad. Sometimes the simplest tools are the best ones. And so, and then I'll change the format to be a meaningful size that people can see. There we go. And so I would actually do given a client has 10 years of credit history, given a client is not eligible for auto approval. And then I would say, and actually I would even change the when a little bit, and I would say, given a questionnaire, given a client has answered 5 out of 9 questions correctly. And then I would say, when the questionnaire is submitted, then the client is eligible for auto approval. That's how I would structure it. So the various conditions, a single action, and then a verifiable result.
Okay, so for me, your third line down there, given a client is eligible, probably not. I think you remove the not, because if something else is already, if some conditions already happened before where they're not eligible, we wouldn't maybe run this check. Is it kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. So if there was, so this is scenario A, right? Okay. There could well be scenario B.
Okay.
And scenario B is a different set of conditions. They are eligible, and let's say they've answered 1 out of 9 questions correctly and the question is submitted, then the client is rejected.
I see. That helps. Thank you.
Yep, my pleasure. Okay, good deal. So I'm not going to ask anyone else to submit one. This actually served its purpose very nicely, and Craig, thank you for letting us beat up on you a little bit. But what I am going to ask is, and I'm going to go ahead and mute you now, but, oh, you muted yourself, perfect. But what I am going to ask is, based off of that, is there anyone that as they look at theirs, they're not sure how they would, there's some piece of it that just doesn't seem like it fits. Like they're not sure how they could take the things that they just saw me do for Craig and know how to adjust theirs. Anyone that feels uncertain about that? Okay, Charity, you have a question. What's up? Oh, I guess I could unmute you. That would be helpful. One moment. Wherever your name is hiding. There it is. So you're able to on my end, but you may have to actually type the question. My question has to do with a story about writing a web service, okay? I guess I would say type your question if you don't have the ability to talk through the software. Okay. What I'm seeing so far, so I'm going to answer David's question while Charity's typing hers. What I'm seeing so far is that this relates to writing good use cases. It is similar, but it's really about writing acceptance criteria for stories. It is analogous to use cases, but you're not going to use use case terminology. We're not going to talk about steps. We're not building a workflow the way you would in a use case. We're crafting concrete scenarios for stories. And I would say it's analogous to use cases, but it's not the same. Oh, okay. So Charity's basically asking, what happens if we've got a story that is a technical story? And it's really a developer that's wanting to do things and they're wanting to just, do inputs and outputs and retrieve things from places. So first of all, I'm going to tell you that BDD and Agile for that matter would tend to recommend not doing those that those would become tasks, not stories. BDD even more so because BDD is about software behavior and about business value and business outcomes. That having been said, I've coached a variety of teams, and certainly those that do this down at that level, to which I would say, yeah, if you needed it down at that level, I would still follow the same basic structure, which is I'd have givens and whens and thens. And so, if it's, in this case, in order to populate and use the QRS, as a developer, I want to write a web service to be able to retrieve the QRS. I would say, given a Java component, given the component has a calculator defined for it, given it has a positive value, when the API request occurs, then I would expect then a QRS value would be returned, and the QRS value would be greater than 17, or whatever it is. So I would still build out the given, when, then structure if I chose to have stories down at that technical level. Okay, good stuff. Moving on. So we had all that. Backing up. Okay, so we are up to essential Gherkin syntax. And additionally, we're at a good brief stopping point. So what I want to do is just give us 2 minutes, just from a bio break perspective, to step out, grab a drink of water, visit the restroom if that's what you need to do, and we will come right back in 2 minutes. Welcome back. All right, let's talk a little bit about Gherkin syntax. So given, when, and then. Given is all about setting up the initial condition that's in place prior to an event occurring. And typically it's going to be multiple conditions. Understand that we're doing all of this, though, so that we can put testing in place. And from a testing perspective, the given statement or the set of statements are all about putting the system into a known state, and that's a part of why it's so important to have specific values, so that you can put the system into a known state in order to support the test. See, BDD is more than just a fancy new way to write requirements. We're actually doing driven development, and the testing is driven that way. And so that means that we need to be able to take our BDD statements and translate them into specific tests. Now, from an analogy standpoint, if this were a use case, you could think of givens like preconditions. But we want to avoid talking about workflows. We want to avoid focusing on user actions. We want to deal with, here's the software behavior with a set of known conditions that then the action portion of it happens in the when statement. So let's imagine that you have the story, in order to drive increased customer interaction, as a customer, I want to share company content through social media. If that was the story, somebody give me an example or two of some valid given statements. And actually, feel free to just type them into the chat. So I'm not seeing anyone weigh in, but some potential given statements here could be, and again, remember, sort of your hint on given is nouns. It could be given a customer, given a social media account, given company content, given company posting. And so any of those could constitute valid given statements. So again, really setting the stage, and what this will ultimately translate into is each of those given statements, there will be a line of code that ends up getting run. And so that line of code would be instantiating that object or setting those values so that you're ready to perform the test. Yeah, so Lewis said, given a customer connects to a URL. Then the when is the triggering event. If this were thought of from a testing perspective, what we're doing here is we are utilizing the when statements to highlight how we interact with the stage that was set by the givens. So with the givens, we set the stage, we instantiated objects, and we set their values and got everything configured. The when statement then comes along and acts in that context. It might even end up behaving as something of a state transition. And by that we mean, in the givens, we set the stage with, here's the current state of the system. The when occurs, and that's the state transition, so that in the then, you then show the new state and how it's changed. So that's like when I was doing my made-up example earlier, and the sort of rationale I did on it's not eligible, but then based off of this action that occurred, they submitted the questionnaire, and the questionnaire had 5 out of 9 questions answered correctly, then it's a state transition, now the client is eligible. So it's pretty common for that to happen. Doesn't mean it happens every time, but it is common. And lastly, the when is always performed by an actor. So if we assume the exact same story, What might be a couple of examples of some valid when statements? So it could be when content is shared, when a customer follows a company's social media content, so Lewis says when a customer connects to the URL, the system would capture the tower location and the phone identification. So that's a little more than we need in the when. The when should only be the action. It should only be the event. So Joanne's example is a closer fit for what we're looking for when a customer places an order. That's a closer match for what we need because it's just focusing on the action that's performed, not all the things that you want the system to do when the action is performed. Finally, we have the then statements, which describes the business outcome. This is what we are expecting as an output. It has to be objective. It needs to be measurable. Really, preferably, it needs to be observable. But it's got to be something we can measure. It's true or false. It's on or off. It's equal to 7. It's equal to 2. It's equal to yes. It is approved. It is denied. Something we could actually validate and prove that it did or did not occur. In a sense, what we're doing is we're verifying that the given or set of givens combined with the when produces an output that either is or is not what we expected. That the result is in that output. And preferably it should be something we can observe. Meaning we want to avoid then statements that say something like a record gets updated in the database. That might be true, but that isn't observable. Not without using a SQL query. So instead, what we would prefer to see is something along the lines of a status code or a confirmation page or a green light turns on or something that can be verified and is observable. So given our previous story, what could be some valid then statements? Then company content is rendered to the phone and Facebook. Sure. Also, BDD really likes things that are very finite. So a good one would be then the share count for the content is increased by 1. Then the account is, or the content is shown. Then something that's tangible, something that's measurable. The then statement should, again, in the case of the social media, could be about the share count increasing, could be about then the content is shown on the customer's feed. It could be then the number of likes is increased by 1. I mean, any number of things like that. Concrete, measurable, verifiable outcomes. Now you could have multiple givens, just like I did in my example. But just like we saw in previous examples, before that, I want to point out that when you do that, understand that all of those have to be true. It's not a choose your own adventure. It's not a, well, if any of these things is given, then the scenario is valid. All of those things are given. It is an entire set. And again, go back to thinking about setting the stage for a test. If you've got this set of givens, that means that when the tests run, They're going to instantiate a user object and an active account. They're going to empty out, zero out the session and make sure there isn't one there. They're going to instantiate a login screen. They're going to provide a username, provide a password. All of those things are set up. And in the context of all those things, the triggering event occurs. And based off of that context, plus that action, you have one or perhaps several outcomes. In this case, we have two outcomes. A session with cached credentials and a confirmation page that's displayed. Both of those must be true, and it should be something that you could measure as being objectively true. So Mary wants to know how in this example were they not eligible and then eligible. So the client was not eligible for auto approval. And I mean, it all depends on what the business case is, but the assumption I was making was that if they answer enough questions correctly, that flips auto approval from false to true. So that was the assumption that I was making. I don't know if that's a valid business rule or not. That all depends on what the business says is legitimate. But that's the way this thing was structured. You're not eligible, but if you answer 5 out of 10 and submit the questionnaire with 5 out of 10 answers correct, bam, now you're eligible for auto.
This is Craig. I like that in the fact that it started off as no one's eligible until you prove you're eligible. So maybe that's how I read your change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's almost like a default. By default, here's your instantiations. Basically, like you said, each given is instantiation of an object.
Yes.
Okay.
Spot on. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. How would you represent an OR case? Yeah, interesting question, Shannon. There's not really a mechanism in BDD to accomplish an OR, at least not in a strict fashion. There's no Boolean structure like that. I mean, you can certainly type, given a questionnaire or previous interview answers. I mean, you could do something like that, and then you have to jump through some hoops in the way that you build the corresponding test case. But strictly from a BDD perspective, this is one sentence. I'm sorry, this is one statement. It is one given statement. It's not two givens that are combined with an or. There isn't that construct. All these givens are true. One of them just happens to have a couple of different variations on it, but then you have to account for those variations programmatically. Okay, good stuff. Oh, Michael wanted to know, since BDD is not as concerned with the user, do we not take into account user personas? No, you totally do. I want to be clear when I say that the user is the least important information. I just mean out of the 3 pieces of information they're the least important. Not that users aren't relevant. It's just that if I'm talking about who's performing this story, why they're performing it, and what it is they're doing, I could make a case for why being the most important. But even if you don't buy that, even if you think the functionality is more important than the why, or you think they're equally important, I think it's pretty obvious that out of the 3 elements we've got there, the least important is who's doing it. Still important, still a part of it, it's just the least valuable. And the reason I know that's true is because if I look at your backlog, I promise you, I'm probably going to see like 4 or 5 different users, different types of users, if that. And I might only see like 2. And so it's, story after story is as a user, as a customer, as a developer, as a whatever, right? And so because of that repetition, I know it's not a value-added piece of the story. The real meat comes in the form of the why and the what. So it's not that users are unimportant or irrelevant. It's just the least important out of those 3 pieces of info. Okay. So we've got all that. All right, so we've got, again, just to recap, we have the story title, the narrative with in order to, as I want to, and then one or perhaps multiple scenarios, each of which are spelling out a concrete manifestation of the story and serving as acceptance criteria, meaning when you satisfy this scenario, and then ultimately when you satisfy this set of scenarios, then I, as the business, will consider this story accepted. That it is doing what we set out for it to do. It has met my expectations of it. So, understanding that context, next exercise is for you to take your other story and elaborate 2 scenarios this time. And do some refactoring in there if you feel it's beneficial. Here again, going to give you 7 minutes to do so. Knowing what you know now, you would have written the story, or really the scenarios differently. So this is your opportunity to take a stab at that. Welcome back. Hey, Craig's jumped out there. So given a client is not eligible for auto approval, given the client has less than 5 years of credit history, given a client has submitted an electronic or paper check, given the check is coming from an account the client owns, given the client has cleared, well, we missed our when statement. So we need an action.
Sorry, it's given the check is cleared. Yeah, sorry, I forgot the when statement.
Yeah, so
given the client is cleared. Sorry, it's given the check is cleared. Okay, so what's the when statement?
Some action that would cause us to evaluate all of that.
I think instead of given the check is cleared, perhaps it's when the check is cleared.
Okay. So the slight tweak on that is BDD would argue that rather than setting up something that's loose and open and says anytime this happens, we want to change it to an intentional action. So it's something more akin to when the client submits a check or when the check is processed, and we would obviously have to have some things in the, well, we do have some things to talk about the check, but it's, you know, something like when a evaluate client submission occurs, or what, like it's like some concrete action that takes place. The easy one is a website, right? It's when they click a button, it's when they choose a drop down, that kind of thing. Like you want an actor to take an action, a triggering event.
So,
but at any rate, so whatever that when statement is, then the client is eligible for auto approval is fine. Yeah, it works, because I was going to say it, but I didn't see it in the given. But yeah, it was the second one, given a client is not eligible for auto approval. Yeah, that's perfect. That works. And there could even be a couple of outcomes. So it could be then the client is eligible for auto approval and a confirmation message is generated.
Yes. Or do you just do multiple thens?
You only do one event. You could have multiple givens and multiple thens.
So again, you can only do one then?
One when,
one
the
when.
action
Okay.
part.
Okay.
But you can have multiple givens and multiple thens.
Okay.
Good. Okay, moving on. So let's talk a little bit about the tooling side of things. You've got various frameworks out there. In the Java community, the two most popular would be JBehave and Cucumber. They're both based off of Java. Well, I say that. They both allow you to write in Java, I should say. Cucumber is actually based off of Ruby. But they have multiple execution options. In addition to this, you could incorporate Jenkins and all sorts of fun things like that. The binding style is such that the story and correspondingly the scenarios are all packaged up in plain text. Then you've got the application code, which is what we're calling domain over there in pure Java. And then the steps class, it says Java, but you almost want to think of it as kind of a hybrid. It has a little of both. It actually is what weaves the story together with the domain class. And the way it does it is that each line, each statement coming from the story in the form of scenario statements, the givens, the whens, the thens, each one of those maps to a particular method inside the steps class. And the implementation of that method will say, let me create a customer object. Let me populate it with these values. Let me create this product list and let me populate it with these values. Let me create a purchase order. Let me create an invoice. Let me create whatever it is. And then in the corresponding when method, it would then call an action on that. And then in the one or more then statements, there'd be a method that actually is checking the results and comparing it to some known value. So for every piece that you see here, a given, a when, a then, there would be a concrete action, a concrete method that's saying what to happen. And then there's also typically a separate configuration file. So JBehave and Cucumber are very similar. If you've done a lot of Java development over the years, JBehave may feel a little more familiar in that it kind of follows the classic Java structure, JDK, SDK interfaces, and so forth. Cucumber is going to be a little bit more modern in its feel. It's very heavy on annotations, very heavy on regex. It's much more configuration driven. It's more lightweight. You kind of pull things on the fly through dependencies, and JBehave has started to incorporate more of that. But just understand that JBehave follows more or less the classic Java approach, and Cucumber is a little more lightweight and nimble. As I said, a lot of different tools that you can use really with either one of these frameworks. And we're going to dig in some more to the technical pieces of it, but before we do that, it's important to realize that BDD is not the same as using JBehave or Cucumber. BDD is a methodology. It's an approach. It's a style of interaction. And there are ways that you can incorporate it to modify how your team operates and how your business works together without necessarily having to use tools. So tools are a nice thing to have, but they aren't necessary. And the flip side is true as well. You can be using Cucumber, you can be using JBehave, and not really embracing behavior-driven development. The Trader example comes from the jbehave.org team. And it is their quintessential representation of behavior-driven development. If you download their examples, you'll find that the Trader example is a thread that's carried through all of it. And there's various stories all around the notion of online stock trading. We're going to look at a simple one first, just to get a feel for it. A trader, and they actually jump straight past all the story stuff and dive right into the scenario. So imagine that above this you have all the normal things like the story title and the narrative before you get to a specific scenario. But they just head straight for the scenario. A trader is alerted of status, given a stock and a threshold of 15. When a stock is traded at 5, then the alert status should be off. When the stock is traded at 16, the alert status should be on. Now this looks a little different than what we've seen before because now we see multiple wins and multiple thens, which sounds like it's at odds with what I told you earlier, but it's not. This is not, contrary to the way it looks, this is not an if-then-else structure. It's not like you do the first win then, and if that one doesn't work, you do the next one. This is not a choose your own adventure. You don't get to pick which when then you want to do. Instead, what this is shorthand. Because what this really equates to, and the way it's executed by JBehave is, the given gets run, the when gets run, the then gets run, and then the given gets run again as a separate scenario. And then the second when gets run, and then the second then gets run. So this is exactly like breaking this out into two scenarios and repeating that same given statement, given a stock and a threshold of 15. It's exactly like having that twice, except we don't. And so it's just a shorthand. It's all condensed down, but both when statements will execute, both then statements will be evaluated, but they will run in separate scopes. One for the first when then, one for the second when then. So it's really just shorthand. And in this case, it doesn't seem like a big deal. We're just saving one line of code, one line of the scenario. But it can get to be a much bigger deal. I mean, you might have had 8 or 9 givens, and if they were all the same, this would actually be kind of handy to just reference them once. Second thing is the steps class. The steps class is where you map the steps from your feature file or story file over into Java. And the way you do that is by annotations. At given, and then whatever that line is. At when, and then whatever that line is. At then, and then whatever that line is. And then what it says is, here's the code that should be executed when this statement occurs. So when you see, given a stock and a threshold of 15, here's the Java code I want you to run in order to accomplish a test. When you see the statement, when stock is traded at 5, here's the code I want you to run. And so in this case, what we're doing, we have to have the exact same English, but there is the capability to dynamically grab some of it and use that inside the method, as you see us doing here with this $sign. Then we have a configuration piece where we can designate things about the format for reporting, where we can designate where to find steps classes, where to find story files. This configuration you would really only need to set up once, and then it'd be used for the whole project. Then executing the stories. A variety of mechanisms available to do that. A common one would be to have your IDE utilizing Maven. But really, any of these would work, and you could even hook it into a Jenkins build. Lastly, the output will, by default, show up on the console, but it is possible to have it generate HTML or PDF or XML as the report output that you could then make available for others to view. So Mary wants to know, since we're assuming the threshold is 15, what if the threshold is different? The threshold is welcome to be different. This is the test we're running. And so what we've got to do is ask the business, ask the business analyst, ask the subject matter expert, what are the scenarios we need to run, we need to account for? And they tell us. And so we identify the 3 or the 4 or the 7 or the 8, maybe the 12 or 14 scenarios that per story that are significant. And you just have to choose a value and run with it. But it's just for the test. So this isn't precluding other values from happening at runtime. This is just what we're choosing to test. Let's talk about using BDD scenarios as acceptance criteria for our stories. The term outside-in development gets tossed around quite a bit in the BDD world. It really is the essence of what we're looking to accomplish within behavior-driven development. We want to define, here's what constitutes success. That's the outside. That's the behavior that the software should demonstrate. What we then want to do is, once we know what success looks like, we want to work from the outside in to implement that. We want to deliver what that output is. And I liken it to when you were a kid and you worked mazes. Whether you figured it out or whether someone else shared it with you, there was an epiphany at some point that goes something like this. Hey, this maze would be a heck of a lot easier if you start at the end and work your way backwards. Because you'll notice, even in this little illustration here, as soon as you walk into the maze at the entrance, there are 3 ways you can go. And only one of those is going to work out well for you. The other 2 are certain doom. And so what do you do with that? Well, That's pretty indicative of what happens in a project. You've got all these different paths you could go down, and you won't know for a while which one is going to be best. But if you work from the outside in, if you define success first and work your way backwards to solve for that, it really streamlines the process and reduces the potential for waste. And so what we want to do is uncover from our stakeholders what success looks like, crystallize that, build tests around it, and then drive all of our development towards achieving that set of goals. Ultimately, software is really about supporting human behaviors. We want to automate human behaviors, replace them. We want software creating things instead of humans creating them. And every change in software behavior should really be about achieving a tangible impact, helping the organization achieve a business goal that they're tracking against. That could be increasing revenue. It could be reducing waste. Maybe they want to improve time to market. Maybe they want to improve customer satisfaction. Maybe it's a quality issue. There's a variety of things that we could be chasing. We want to crystallize what the goal is, and then we want to orient everything around achieving that. The driving force and what's articulated in the story and ultimately what's accomplished via the scenarios should be all about supporting one or perhaps a couple of business goals. That's why we flip the script and have a story lead with the business value. That's why inside of our story files, we then put that same information at the front, so that before you look at a specific scenario, you're reminded of the story and what it's trying to achieve. That's why the then statement of every scenario is measurable and validatable, so that we can prove that we're actually doing what we set out to achieve. Now, along the way, there are certainly opportunities for miscommunication. There are opportunities for us to miss the potential. And a common mistake is to see this construction of scenarios as a stack of busy work that needs to get done, as a necessary evil that is currently stopping the process from moving along, and we need to just get some of those scenarios built, knocked out, and move on. And so I see oftentimes people will just hand that job off to one person. Hey, will you go build out a bunch of scenarios so we can do the next step of the project? And I can't stress enough why that's not helpful. BDD is highly collaborative. First and foremost, it is an invitation to a conversation. It is not just a new way of building out your acceptance criteria. It's an opportunity to collaborate with various perspectives, multiple inputs, to come up with a better understanding of the story and its scope and its risk, and to get the right balance between depth and breadth, business and technical, and ensure that we're taking a test-centric, quality-centric approach along the way. That combination of perspectives is often referred to as the three amigos: Tech, QA, and BA. Do any of you currently have a three amigos step in your process? Or otherwise, could you care to weigh in on things you've seen work well or not work well with those various perspectives collaborating? Not a problem. You might have noticed that there is a tendency for testing to get cut from the budget. When the chips are down, project deadlines are tight, it often finds itself on the chopping block. Why do you think that is? Sometimes I think the simplest answers are the best answers. Tests, more often than not, aren't seen as what I like to call shared capital, meaning not everybody's got a vested interest in it. Not everybody sees it as valuable, sees it as something that they consider important. Instead, testing far too often is perceived as an expectation, a requirement of we have to do that, or it's something that one department keeps bellyaching about and they really need it to, you know, check all the boxes that they've got there. It's a necessary evil. It's a hurdle we have to overcome. How do we deal with that? How do we get buy-in and change someone's perception? I would suggest to you that we get that by shifting not only to a test-driven approach, but ultimately a behavior-driven one, and one where tests aren't constructed simply for their own sake, but they're constructed as a natural derivation of what the business has agreed they're interested in seeing occur. Right, so BDD is really changing the conversation. They're changing testing from being something that you gotta do, something that one team cares about, and changing it instead to something that is actually the embodiment of what the business agreed to. Right, so backing it up, we've got the story, and then as we're collaborating with the customer or the product owner or the BA or the SME or whomever we have access to, as we're collaborating with them, we're going, okay, so you told me this is the story, but what's that look like? Let's carve out 4 or 5 or 8 specific scenarios that demonstrate that story in action. And we'll then use those English statements that describe the scenario. We'll use that as the test cases. We will build test cases word for word based off of those. And so now our tests aren't just a collection of things we feel like we wanted to check, but our tests are actually the validation that our software is doing what it was designed to do, what you told us was necessary. Remember, this is our acceptance criteria. And so when we build automated tests based off of the BDD statements with preconditions, a distinct action, and a verifiable result, and we bake that into automated tests, now we have a confirmed way of proving that we really have achieved what the business said we needed to achieve. And so it's really about driving that common ownership. And what I regard as shared capital. So if you hadn't realized it already, successful BDD comes down to communication and collaboration. You've got the technical person that's looking at the system and looking at the problem space in terms of its functions and its variables and its inputs and its outputs and how all the components are going to be knit together. At the same time, a business person is looking at the system from the outside in terms of the value it's going to generate, in terms of the way that the solution is going to be used. To the extent that it's possible, you also bring in a third perspective, looking at quality and objective measures of the degree to which all of this is carried out. And so BDD is really a process and a tool set that aids our dialogue and collaboration as a team to crystallize as early as possible, not just what did you say, but what did you mean? How's it going to be used? What's that look like? And how do we measure it? And so then, as a part of that collaboration, developers can hone in on some of the technical ambiguities and say, all right, now you said this should happen during the day. Let's clarify what you mean by day. Like what's the real time frame? Like, did you mean a 24-hour period? Did you mean during business hours? Did you mean while it was daylight? Like, what does day really mean? And also, business people get to have their considerations because they could go, whoa, that term you're using has a very specific meaning in our context. It's an overloaded term. It has a special connotation. I think we want to use a different term here. And so if you are, as a team, committed to being agile, I would suggest to you that BDD is a very natural fit because it takes all the things agility has, but then it increases the rigor. It adds additional clarity. It can be folded into any methodology. It doesn't have to be an agile method. I mean, you could use this with waterfall. but it particularly lends itself well to taking your Scrum or Kanban or whatever you're doing and tightening up some pieces of it by helping to uncover hidden risks, actually empower your product owner to prioritize the backlog. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but we tell product owners to prioritize the backlog, and then they go look at a backlog, and you know what they see? As a user, as a user, as a customer, as a customer, as a customer, as a manager, as a manager, as a supervisor, they have to completely read the full story to even get a hint of what the story's doing. In the BDD model, they look over and they see, in order to increase customer satisfaction, in order to improve the customer experience, in order to streamline processing with third parties, and suddenly they start to get an inkling of what's the motivation behind that story, what's its value, and they could start to realistically shift things around and prioritize the backlog based on value. You get better sizing and better estimates through things like the Three Amigos and the acceptance criteria, giving you a really clear understanding of the scope of your story. Plus, the just enough aspect of Agile lets you iron out what the business really needs from a story by way of the scenarios. And lastly, all the communication, all the collaboration just helps to clarify things. So there's a lot of wins in our category there. Okay, we're going to take our last break. We're going to break here for, again, 2 minutes. Let you stretch, grab, refresh your water, grab some coffee if I'm putting you to sleep, whatever you might need to do. But I'm going to set the timer for 2 minutes, and then we'll come right back. Welcome back. Hold on one moment. I just need to answer a question real quick in chat. Okay, very good. So let's talk about regular expressions. First off, I'll just make the statement that there is within a BDD context, a fairly common situation of multiple statements from your feature file or story file, multiple ones that need to be mapped to the same functionality in the steps class, the same testing activity, instantiating something, calling a method, what have you. And there's a couple of different ways of doing that. In JBehave, there's a notion of an alias annotation where you can map one annotation at given a user has an account, but then maybe there's another statement coming from either that same feature file or maybe from a different feature file, but using the same code, where you would want to map a different statement, so a customer with an existing account. And although the English is different, then the actual functionality might be the same. And so the way you do that is with an alias. Cucumber, on the other hand, doesn't have an alias. It drives everything through regular expressions. And so the way that Cucumber maps your English statements to the testing code that would be run is with regular expressions. So, for example, if you had in your feature file or story file, given a user has an account, given a customer with an existing account, it could map both of those with a blank dot star blank account. So then it would match actually any statement, any given statement that had a in it, followed by some stuff, followed by account. Now you've got to be careful with something that open-ended, because you could end up mapping to a whole bunch of things that you didn't intend to. So you've got to be careful with those matching expressions. You won't find support for all the capabilities that regex has, but a good number of them, right? So dot for a single character, dot plus matches at least one character, but could be any number. Dot star matches 0 or more characters. If you specifically want these characters to only be numbers, you can do that using either brackets with the range of numbers in question, or you could do it with //d, and d refers to digit. And so then whether you put a plus behind it or an asterisk behind it varies whether you have to have one or more digits or whether it could be nothing or multiple. Another really common one is the question mark. Question mark is used when you want to match against something with an optional letter. So a really common scenario might be, I want to be able to match a or match an, A-N. And so A-N with a question mark on it means the N is optional. Similarly, if something has been made plural by adding an S, you could put a question mark after it and the S would become optional. So let's look at an example of character matching. Then, so this is a then statement, dot star space found. And when that matches on whatever it matches, it will then call the found stuff method in the steps class, which will then proceed to execute whatever methods and statements it needs to in order to accomplish the fact that it found stuff. That annotation there would map against, would match against, then 2 movies should have been found. Then I found my purpose. Then check the lost and found. A lot of times people assume that since found is the last word in the annotation, in the statement, then it has to be the last word in the step you're matching it to, but it doesn't. It can find that anywhere. It doesn't have to be the last word, and that's why the second one works just fine. It'll match those anywhere it's located. On numeric matching, as I mentioned, you can do brackets with the numbers in it or //d. A plus means you have to have at least 1 digit. A star would mean 0 or more digits. And so this one right here would match against the following. 2 movies should have been found. It'll also match against, but it would not match against 1 movie should have been found. The 1 is fine because that's a digit, but the problem is the letter S. And so the way we would solve that is with a question mark after the S. So then this would match on 2 movies, 1 movie, but it would not match on a movie because A is not a digit. Any questions on that before we move on? Oh, there was a question earlier. Is BDD mainly used for GUI-based systems? Not at all. Any rules about what percentages of acceptance criteria should be turned into automated tests? It came to my attention having a big number of tests can be unmaintainable. Sure. So the thing to realize here is BDD is not exactly the same as TDD, test-driven development. We are not aiming to create an absolutely comprehensive, boil the ocean, test everything on the planet. Again, it's more of the 80-20 kind of a thing. What is the proverbial 20% that solves 80% of the situations? So we're looking for the big rocks. We're looking for the main scenarios, the main manifestations of the story. So it's only going to be a handful anyway. Like I told you, my kind of rule of thumb is 7 ± 2. I would tend to expect the majority of your stories to have in the ballpark of 5 to 9 scenarios, give or take. But again, with there being a bell curve distribution. Then in the context of a given scenario, which by the way is the same as acceptance criteria, should that be turned into an automated test? Absolutely. Every scenario should have an automated test associated with it. But not every automated test needs to become a scenario. Good question. Okay, so next we've got parenthesis and its use in matching. Adding a question mark to the end of a letter is great when we want to make one letter optional. But what happens when what we need to match is more complex than that? We can't just add a bunch of question marks. So the way you do that is by grouping it together with parentheses and then use an or, meaning this line right here would match against statements from the story or feature file, such as she does accept the call, but also she doesn't accept the call. Evidently, the implementation of the handle call acceptance method is sufficiently flexible to support both of those situations. So we can map both of those to the same statement here in the steps class. Now, sometimes what we want to do is take the information and we capture it using the parenthesis, and we've grouped that together and we've captured it to pass it into the method. So here what we've done is we've captured the number of movies that were found. I'm assuming that we did a keyword search or something like that and found some movies. We take that number of movies and we pass it into the method, and you see inside the method now we've defined a variable to say I want to take at runtime, at test time if you will, the number of movies that was referenced in the feature file and pass it into this method so that we can respond to it dynamically. What this will allow you to do is build out 2 or 5 or 50 scenarios. Each of those scenarios could have different values, different movies being searched for. It could have different amounts of money being withdrawn for the ATM. It could be any of the different scenarios needed. And because there's this ability in a pattern structure for us to grab chunks of the statement and pass it on the fly into our method, then our tests can be responsive and tailored to that specific scenario without us duplicating our testing code all over the place. Questions or comments on that? Okay. There is also the ability to tie our expression that we're matching against to the front or the back of the string. So remember earlier I told you when we were looking at found being the last word in the phrase, that didn't mean it had to be the last word in the annotation that we're matching against. That's true, it doesn't have to be. But if you wanted it to be, you've got that capability. So if you take an expression and you add a caret on the front, that means that that expression must be at the very beginning of any string it's going to match to. If you put a $sign at the end, that means that that string that you're looking for has to be at the end of a statement. And so if you use both caret and $sign, you can say it must be exactly this statement. So with the example of I'm logged in and I'm logged in as admin, if your regular expression was simply I'm logged in, it would map to both of those. If you only wanted it to map to the first one, you could do it with caret on the front, $sign on the back. And really, considering that both of these start with I'm logged in, you'd only really have to put the $sign in. By putting the caret in, it just further reinforces and ensures that in the future, you don't accidentally match against this if you didn't want to.
This is Craig. I think
Yeah.
I caught on. So is it the fact that as like a text or a string comes through the class, it's being caught by these reg expressions and running the appropriate methods? Is that?
Yep.
Okay, I just caught that. Sorry, I was confused.
Yeah, no worries. So if we slide back to this slide here, the story or feature file is plain text, and what it consists of is the story description and all of the givens, whens, thens. All of that is there in plain text. It's this file here. It's just givens and whens and thens. Then the steps class is the piece in the middle, and it says, when you encounter given a stock and a threshold of 15, I want you to run this first method right here called @given a stock and a threshold of X. And I want you to take X, whatever X is, and pass it into the aStock method as a double. Then what I want you to do is instantiate a new stock object using that data. When you encounter a when statement, I want you to find out the price and pass that in and do a trade on that stock that was previously created. And when you encounter a then, I'm going to have something, remember, that is verifiable, something I can validate, something that is objectively true or false. Usually that means we're going to create an assertion. In this case, we're going to retrieve the status, check it against the status we expect, and assert that we got what we expected to get. Is that helpful?
Yeah. It's pretty smart. I like it. It's good.
Yeah, it's really, really clean. And this is, as these pieces are starting to kind of fall together, maybe this is the right time to kind of step back for a second and say, this is what I meant when I was talking about shared capital. We're not testing for its own sake. We're not testing 50 things that the testing team feels like they want to test so they can sleep better at night. No, we literally collaborated with the business and got agreement that said the following 6 scenarios are the big rocks that if we satisfy those 6 scenarios, they will consider the story to be accepted. Well, boy howdy, if those are the 6 they care about and that's what's standing between me and having my story accepted, then I'm going to drive my development around achieving and verifying I've achieved that behavior. So behavior-driven development is all about going, okay, let's carve out, these are the scenarios of the story the business cares about. We've got a bunch of code sitting over here in what's called domain. We've got a bunch of code there that may or may not be compliant. Let's write steps that literally bind the statements that we got the business to sign off on, they bind to specific testing executions of Java code or whatever programming language. By the way, Cucumber has like a dozen different languages it supports. And then use that as the validation that we did what we set out to do. So much so that when you get to the demo at the end of your iteration or sprint, what you demo is the scenarios. You said, hey, business, you told us these 6 scenarios are what's important to you. We're now going to walk through and show you how we accomplish those scenarios. And oh, by the way, developers avoided gold plating because the structure of test-driven, behavior-driven, and building tests first and having a test harness really minimizes the potential for getting off on bunny trails and doing things just for grins and giggles. And so all of this fancy pants regex stuff is simply about going, okay, if I've got content in the story or feature file and I need to then map it to specific testing code in the steps class, I need a way of telling the compiler, telling the testing engine, telling the framework for this particular line of English, here's the equivalent portion of the testing harness to run. And you could do that by just having everything explicitly stated and just spell it out word for word. A user has an account, a customer with an existing account. Or you can start getting a little more clever, a little more flexible, a little more reuse, and begin to match on regular expressions, which then have all manners of complexity and options available for you to facilitate that matching. And substitution and grabbing information and passing it into the method. So here's an example of, I've got 3 different places where I have 1 or more characters, but only 2 of them I'm passing in, and they pass in respectively to title and to author. So lastly, we want to talk about good scenarios versus bad scenarios. Effective story writing and correspondingly effective scenario writing involves employing as much as possible natural language. And that brings us full circle back to the very first slide that I talked you through, which said, hey, one of the things that's kind of unique about BDD is this emphasis on natural language constructs. We want as much as possible to take the words straight from the business, straight from the product owner, straight from the BA, and go, okay, that English you just gave me, maybe with a little bit of massaging, with a little bit of structure in the form of givens, whens, and thens, that English that you naturally gave me is what I'm going to use to write the tests, to scope the development work, and to validate that the devs did what they said, what they actually set out to do. As opposed to what we normally do, which is use cases and stories and requirements, and we capture those in English, but then we leave it up to IT to go, all right, you kind of extrapolate for yourselves something that approximates these English statements. BDD flips that around and says, nope. We may have to do a little bit of extra work on the front end. We may have to massage it. We may have to fold in a little bit of clunky given, when, then language, but we're going to use natural English as much as possible, and unaltered, we're going to use that to, throughout the life cycle of the project, test and verify that we did what we said we were going to do. Also, good stories, good scenarios, look for domain-specific terms and concepts, call those out, define them clearly, and then consistently use them. Calling out, focusing on, and aligning with business goals early and often is crucial. And of course, we can't stress enough the importance of customer involvement. It's also important we get this at the right level of abstraction. So if a more technical person is doing this, they might break everything down into all the minutiae. Whereas someone who tends to operate more at the 10,000 foot view would treat that exact same scenario with a really high level of visibility. There isn't one right answer. There isn't a specific level of depth that you should or should not go to. What is important is that you're consistent. Whatever your level of abstraction is, within the context of a given feature or story, for the scenarios that are a part of it, absolutely remain consistent. If you're way down in the weeds on one scenario, be way down in the weeds on all the scenarios. As much as possible, even try to be consistent across stories, but at a bare minimum, consistent level of abstraction within the context of a given story or feature. And goal alignment, of course, is critical for good scenarios. That means that we lead with the why. That means that every single scenario represents a verifiable business outcome, something you can validate, something that is objectively true or false. Feature files include the story, even comments maybe to reinforce the value. You can have feature files that only have the scenario in it, but I highly, highly recommend, particularly if we've gone to the effort of making sure that there is a why, and I've seen a lot of stories of Agile teams where they just forgot to put the why or didn't think it was important or just restated the story again, but a meaningful and distinct why, and you lead with it, then at the beginning of each feature file, you can indicate here's the story and here's the business value. And then finally, on the front end, brainstorming work that's goal-centric, a prioritized backlog led by business value. All of these things allow us to move BDD into the forefront in our planning and our collaboration and driving more and more value for the business. And so what questions did you have that you were hoping we'd address in this session that we haven't had a chance to?
Craig, I'm wondering, do you ever have things like given scenario one? So can you kind of block a bunch of things together and make sure they run before you start scenario two? For kind of like efficiency, so you don't have to.
Are you thinking like setup and tear down type stuff for tests? Yeah, absolutely. So there are hooks available called before and after. And you do an at before and you do an at after. And so yeah, there's even something called background, which lets you run something before all the scenarios. And so yeah, there are mechanisms in place for supporting that kind of setup and tear down.
And the next question is, do people use this to figure out the size of the project they're working on?
Yes, because what happens so often is you really think that you've got a medium story. And then as you start carving out the specific manifestations of that story with the business and laying out what is really viable acceptance criteria, you suddenly go, oh, wow. Hidden inside of what I thought was a medium is 3 mediums and a small. But I didn't know it because we just looked at the story at face value and we wouldn't have known it for 3 months until we really got in to implement it, and then we go, oh, yeah, there's a lot more complexity here than I realized. So it definitely helps with your estimation and your risk reduction.
Where in the timeline of, say, Agile and software development does this fit? Is this like a brand new concept after the Agile stories and people thought, well, they needed more structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. You can really find the origins of it in earnest probably about 3 years ago, maybe 4. And so Agile we've got well over a decade on at this point, 15 years or so. And so it's maybe after 10, 12 years, something to that effect, that we went, yeah, there's there's some opportunities to firm this up a bit.
Is there like is there I say has this morphed again into something else that people are grabbing onto, or
not so far. And if you want to get it straight from the horse's mouth, the gentleman that is the father of BDD is Dan North, DANNORTH. And his blog is a good one as well. So I'll go ahead and type that in chat. Oh, I sent that as private. 1 second. Entire audience. Dan North. There we go. Good questions. What else? All right, perfect. Anything jump out at you in terms of particular aspects of BDD that really resonated as being particularly interesting or particularly valuable?
I like the structure. Like, for example, it's a good way perhaps to utilize an offshore team to kind of catch you up on some things, right? So after you've maybe already implemented something and you haven't properly put the structure around it as far as testing, to kind of get that regression or kind of get that understanding, I think the vocabulary is good, and also the structure, so they understand, you know, even how to structure the classes underneath.
Mm-hmm.
Because unfortunately we didn't, you know, put good testing in
Right.
around everything. But now we have you know, all kinds of code and stuff like that, that even if you put this on the front of it, it kind of gives it context and organization, even if the code in behind perhaps isn't well structured to the context of the project delivery. If that makes sense, like sometimes when you just look at the code on its own, you don't understand the reasons why or the decisions made as to why this is there. But if you can now kind of put a facelift on it with something like this, it adds the structure and adds the context, I think it's helpful for everyone. Or do you think that that's maybe wishing too much?
No, I think there's some real potential there.
Okay. So do most people treat this as a go forward rather than like a fix? You know,
yes.
like, okay.
Yeah, and it very much is a spectrum. It's not an all or nothing kind of thing. Like, you could look at BDD and say, I'm just going to use this to firm up my acceptance criteria. Because right now, I've got no guidance on what an acceptance criteria ought to look like. And so I'm going to use BDD just for that. And I'm not even going to mess with the framework stuff at all. And then in time, as you get more comfortable with that, you could then go, okay, well, now what we're going to do is we're going to start actually, you know, tracking the acceptance criteria in Jira, and our development team is going to suck those down into their tool in the form of a comment so that there is at least looking at it when they're building their code. And then next, we're, you know, so you could just, and then eventually get to the framework and the automated tests and all that. I mean, there really is quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how much of it you take on, how much you bite off all at once, and what you decide to do with it.
It's interesting you mentioned Jira, because we're heavy users of Confluence, and we do put user stories into Confluence. Are you aware of a plugin in Confluence where you can create, you know, the BDD scenarios? And
I have some teams utilizing Jira plugins. I would imagine that there's similar ones for Confluence.
Okay.
Good stuff. Anybody else? Oh, one person wants to know most popular BDD tools out there. Yes, Cucumber, JBehave, all of those would constitute, you know, the two more popular ones. Serenity for sure. On the web testing side of things, people hook it in with Selenium. You know, it's pretty common to build all of this up in Maven, and if you're already using Jenkins, to have that managed build. bamboo, all of those things end up getting incorporated. Okay, very good. Well, I certainly appreciate your time and attention. I hope that this was beneficial for you. There will be a recording made available at some point, but in case you missed anything, also be sure and grab the handout if you haven't done that already. But thank you so very much. Have a terrific day and a wonderful weekend.